find it really interesting that different cultures have different ways of expressing distress. And I know you've done a bit of work in this area and written a paper on it. Could you tell us a bit more about this?
Okay, so idioms of distress, I guess, refers to the fact that every culture in the world has certain ways of talking about, describing distress. And so, and the way that we talk about and think about and communicate our distress actually shapes our experience of it as well. So there's been a lot of work done on this concept, specifically started by Arthur Kleinman in the 70s and lots of other people. So I guess part of looking at idioms of distress is acknowledging that the Western model of psychiatry and psychology is just one example of a set of idioms of distress. And the criteria that we might have for how something like depression is described or expressed or experienced is specific to the Western countries that those things like the DSM come from. So there's been a lot of movement to look at, in different cultures, how do people think about and describe distress, and what can this tell us about how their experience fits into the social and political context that they live in, and then this can help us to understand how we can actually respond to that distress. And part of that's really important is being aware of the culturally situated nature of our own practice, so that we can avoid potentially like a neo-colonialism in the care that we provide, which might invalidate people's experiences if we don't take their own idioms of distress into account.
So I just want to disclose that I hadn't thought about colonialism, neo-colonialism, all that kind of stuff, all those words before I met you. It's just like my confession. And I'm just wondering whether it could be helpful to explain some of those concepts for people who also haven't considered those topics, especially when you've spent most of your practice in Australia, and you haven't practiced outside, so you haven't come across some of these ideas potentially.
Okay, big topic. I guess there's lots of different terms that go around, like there's decolonizing practice, there's colonizing, there's neo-colonialism, there's coloniality, and I don't know if it really matters too much what all those terms might mean specifically, but I guess it's just thinking about the fact that the tradition of psychology and psychiatry have originated out of settler colonial states. So, either countries like Australia, which have been built by settling and, displacing and also, committing genocide against the Indigenous peoples, but also colonizing nations like Britain and France and so on. And so part of that history of colonization has been to center those forms of knowledge as legitimate and other forms of knowledge as, barbaric, uncivilized, savage, whatever it is. If we think about your classic 19th century anthropologists studying other human beings like they're animals and fitting them into categories. And so we need to, I guess, keep in mind that the history of psychology is bound up with that history of dispossession and extraction of resources and so on. And so although, you might say, well, the era of colonialism has passed. For a lot of people who experience the ongoing impacts of those processes, it's very much something that's in the present. And the context that we're talking about working in are contexts which have been colonized in the past. So Syria was colonized by France, and Bangladesh was colonized by England. And so there's a really complex history there, which it's just really important to be aware of, and to think critically about whether or not any of the practices that we engage in, or the ways that we speak, or the ways that we think about knowledge, whether they continue to reproduce those really big international forces which serve to keep countries like Australia in a more privileged position.
I am just reflecting on how it's important as a Australian supervisor to be wary of not only your own culture, not only someone else's culture and the way they think and so on, but also as psychology, as a culture that comes from certain cultural ideas and values and beliefs. And once you have that, it's not about saying it's wrong or whatever. Sorry, there's a fly. It's just about recognizing that's the lens you're using. And the other part of it is recognizing that having, so places like Syria, Bangladesh, Palestine, lots of places in the world where they are low income, low resource, they haven't had the time, energy, resource to develop their own, I guess, response to what we call mental health or mental wellness. They might call it something else, but they haven't necessarily got what's the word, an academic or published or scientific justification like we have, but it's no less legitimate for them. So what has happened is you have, this is just the way I have seen it, you have, Syrian psychologists, Bangladesh psychologists who have learnt psychology and the way the human brain works or the way mental health is from a Western perspective, but they haven't had then this other space or as much space and time to then think about how it applies, and adapting it well to their own cultures. And so what can happen sometimes is you have practitioners, in my experience, who are applying a Western model to a non-Western culture, and it doesn't always fit. And so sometimes when they bring a problem to me as a supervisor and they're saying, I've tried exposure therapy and it doesn't work, it may not be the same as an Australian psychologist coming to me saying, I've tried exposure therapy, it doesn't work. In Australia, the issues why it doesn't work might be related to the relationship they have with the client or some technical issues in the way they're applying it. But with a Syrian or Bangladeshi psychologist, it might just be that that's just not, that the formulation isn't right for that person because it's a completely different cultural formulation, or it might be that it is the right formulation, but it's not the right strategy because they haven't considered really important cultural factors like gender issues, religious issues, family issues. So what I'm trying to say is sometimes it's important to just come back to the practitioner and getting them to be in touch with their own wisdom about their own culture, and then asking whether what they're applying, which is a Western model, and letting them realize it is a Western model you're using, and that's fine. Is that actually appropriate here? Is it applicable? And not letting them disengage too much from their own instinct because they think what they're doing has to be the Western way. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's just a reflection I have when you talk about an application.
And another piece of context, which I think is important to provide, is, I guess, how the work that these practitioners are doing can kind of fits into the international humanitarian system. So the people that you'll be providing supervision to will be from a mix of professional backgrounds. And some people might have had, might come from other professions and have been provided with short training as lay professionals. But of course, the work that they're doing actually requires the same amount of skill and the ability to cope with complexity as someone who's done a PhD's worth of training. So, you know, that's one part of the system, but then you've got this international system that's driven from, you know, overseas by the priorities of the donors, which is often focused on the number of people that people see rather than their ability to provide a quality service or to protect the well-being of the practitioners themselves. So I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind